In the last video, we took a look at drafting circle skirts with more than one seam, how we can create internal lines and modify those internal lines using the curve points and curvature tools to change the shape of our style lines, how to cut and sew those internal lines to create seams and style lines in the garments and the pattern pieces. We looked at modifying the circle skirts to turn them into handkerchief skirts, how to add layers so that we can tell the system which layer sits on top of another, which pattern piece lays on top of another. We looked at points of measure again, so we could start getting measurements for our tech packs and things like that to help us with the drafting as well. I'm going to show you how we can install zippers in this example. If you're making a mock-up, you may or may not install any closures, but I do want to show you how it can be done in the system, how we add zippers. We'll also look at how we can add seams and hem allowances so we can start finalizing our patterns and get them ready to construct. So I'm going to, I want to get rid of this point of measure here just because it's in my way. I want to place some side seams. I can select the point of measure and delete it if I want to, or I can go over here into my 2D window in the 2D information display. And right here, it looks like a little ruler. I can just click on that. It'll hide it. It'll still be there, but I'll just hide it so it's not in my way while I'm drafting. I'm going to use my internal polygon or line tool. I'll make a center back seam and 2 side seams on both layers. You'll notice I can constrain. I don't have any points up here to snap to, so I can hold down Shift to constrain my movement on my mouse, or I can just let the smart guides do its job. Once I see that pink, hot pink line, it's letting me know that it is constrained to my vertical and horizontal axes. And I will use my edit pattern tool to select all those lines I just made. Right click on any one of them and cut and sew. So that'll go ahead and add some seams to this. Now I'm going to put my zipper into the center back here because that's where my closure would go if I were installing this on an actual garment. To do that, I'm going to select the sewing relationships in center back and delete them for right now, just so that can open up a little bit. Got a little bit of space in here. I'm going to add my zipper to my top layer. I want my zipper to be 18 inches, 8 inches. I can make it 8 or 9 inches long, so it's deep enough to go to open up in the hip. I can use my edit pattern tool and I can see this center back seam is 13.3 inches. So I like to give myself a guideline as to how long my zipper should be. I can use my split add point or split line tool. And here I'm going to give myself an 8-inch long zipper. So I want to give myself a point of reference at my center back seam. I'm going to right click with that tool. That'll bring up my split line contextual menu. You'll notice 2 lines. There's a line 1 in yellow and line 2 highlighted in blue. And you should see a blue highlight on one side of the line segment, and you can't really see it here because it's covered with a red line, but there is a yellow line here. So this is referring to line 1, that segment here, and line 2 down here. And I want this, where my waistline goes down my center back seam, to be 8 inches. So I'm going to select this and write 8 inches in there. Split into 2 lines, 8 inches. So I want that 8 inches deep, and click OK. That'll put that point right there. And just to verify, that is 8 inches long. I can do the same thing over here. Again, 8 inches. Good. So that gives me an idea of how deep my zipper needs to go. I can do the same thing back here, but there we go. 8 inches. And that kind of snaps to the 8-inch mark there. So that should be 8 inches, 8 inches. Cool. Now over in the 3D toolbar, you'll see this little icon. It's a zipper. If for whatever reason you're looking at any of the toolbars and you're missing icons, you're missing tools, you can right click in any of the toolbars and check to make sure that all of the tools are active, they're turned on and they're visible. They should all have check marks next to them. Same thing in the 2D window. If for some reason you look at this and you see, oh yeah, there's all of them are checked, but I'm missing tools. What might be happening, and I see this happening on laptops a lot, where there's not quite as much screen real estate, sometimes there will be tools that are hiding just to make room on the screen. And if you hover over them, you'll see these little downward facing, it's like a double downward facing arrow. It means that there are tools hiding up underneath there. And you click on that little downward facing arrow, it'll bring up those hidden tools. Mainly, you just need to drag these little double lines to make more room. So there's these little double lines that you can click and drag. You can pull tools out, you can dock them back in, and you can move them around however you see fit. But sometimes there'll be tools that are literally hidden. They'll be there, but you will not be able to see them at all. So if for some reason you're missing that zipper tool, look for some double downward facing arrows, and it might be hiding under there. I'm going to click on that zipper tool, and you can use this in the 3D window or the 2D window. I'm going to use it in my 2D window on my smaller top layer here. I'm going to click once at my waistline, hover my mouse, and then double click at my 8-inch point. It'll turn gray to let me know, like, hey, I've got one half of your zipper. Where do you want the other half? I'm going to start again at this point on my waistline and double click at that other point. It's going to take a minute for my computer to catch up. And you may notice, if I zoom in here, there's parts of my zipper. There are my little zipper teeth in there. The head of my zipper is hanging out here. I can simulate, it'll snap that zipper together. And there are my zipper teeth. You can still pull the zipper head and manipulate where the zipper is going. I think half of my zipper is going in the wrong direction because it looks a little bit gray over there. Zippers will snap together your pattern pieces, and you can kind of visualize what your garment will look like when you have a zipper installed. It's still a finicky kind of tool. It still takes a little bit of getting used to. For example, this one is showing me a separating zipper at the bottom. You can always go in and change that with your select move tool. Over in the property editor, you can change the zipper head. You can change different styles to the zipper head. You can change the zipper puller, so you can put a smaller pull on there. If it's an invisible zipper, it's going to have a smaller pull on there. So now it's a nice little tiny pull tab. You can change the bottom of it, so it's no longer separating. It's just got a end cap to it. You can change the gauge on it. This is a very thick zipper. I might want to go for a smaller zipper. These are just going to make them bigger, but I can change the color of the zipper, of the slider, the puller, that's the top of it. You can change the stopper colors, so the end stops, you can change the colors of those, the colors of the teeth. You can make them metallic if you'd like. I'll go with custom gauge. Usually there used to be a measurement. You could actually put in the measurement for them. So if I want to change the gauge on this, let me see if I select the actual teeth. There we go. That'll let me change it. So select move tool on the head, the zipper pull, or the zipper stopper. Lets you change the gauge of those elements. And if you click on the teeth themselves, it brings up new information. You can change the width of the teeth, the total width of the zipper. Maybe I want it 1/4 inch wide on the teeth. That'll make the teeth slightly smaller. It's made my zipper a little bit narrower. So you can change these elements, type, whether you want it plastic or metal or something like that. You can change all that in here. You can change the color of the zipper, the color of the stopper. So you can get into really intricate details. I'm going to sew the rest of my seams together. I'm not worried about this because this is already being held together by my zipper. I'm going to sew that together, and then I'm going to sew these pieces because those would essentially become like a lining for the inside of my zipper. All right, so I've got a zipper installed. I've got layers and whatnot. I'm not too worried about that. You can change, once you've gotten these pattern pieces to the layer that you want, you can leave the layers on and it'll keep it this neon green. You can put them back to 0 if you want to go back to seeing the actual color of your fabric. Just be aware that if you don't leave that layer set as a positive or a negative number, it may cause some distortion during animation, which we'll look at in the next video. Let's add seam allowance and hem allowance so that we have these patterns ready to go. I'm just going to space my pattern pieces apart just so I have some wiggle room to add my seam allowance. And I'm going to zoom out so I can see all my pieces. I'm going to go with a standard 1/2 inch seam allowance for all of my pattern pieces, and then I'll do a 1 inch hem allowance just so you can see the difference between the two. This is your seam allowance tool. It looks like a little bodice with a bold blue edge and a little mouse attached to it. I'm going to click on that. I'm going to click and drag a bounding box around all of my pieces. It will select all of the edges and automatically add a default seam allowance, which is set to 1 centimeter or 0.394 inches. Now I want 0.5 inches, so I'm going to drag again with that seam allowance tool, and you'll notice all of my edges are now highlighted, and I can input 0.5 into the width of my seam allowance, and it will change the width of that. Just let me go back so you can see the difference. So I'm zoomed in here. You can see that's 0.3, 0.5. It's going to make it slightly larger, a little bit bigger. So now I've got 1/2 inch seam allowance around everything. That's easy enough to do. And now I'm going to add a hem allowance around the hem of my skirt. So that's going to be slightly different. I'm just going to shift click all of those edges that correspond to my hem. So I'm holding down shift. And using the seam allowance tool, I'm selecting all the edges that I know will become my hemline. And again, in the property editor, I can write in 1 inch or 1.5 inches, 1.25 inches. And you'll notice now I have a much larger seam allowance, quote unquote, seam allowance on these edges that I selected and a smaller seam allowance on all my other edges. So you can dictate hem allowances, seam allowances, and the size of them. Just be sure to select the edges first and then update the seam allowance or hem allowance you'd like in the property editor. The next thing I want to add are notches, because we're definitely going to have some kind of information on how to sew everything back together. All of these lines and individual dots and points, these little split lines, like where we want our zipper to end, those will not print on a final pattern. We're going to have notches so we can determine where to put everything. And the tool, the notch tool, is sitting right above the seam allowance tool. It looks like a little perpendicular icon with a mouse attached to it. I'm going to click on that notch tool. Notch tool is super simple. I placed a point here when I was determining how deep I want my zipper to be. I can just click on that point and it will automatically add a little notch to my pattern piece and another one corresponding along the seam allowance. Now, let's say, for example, I didn't have this point here. I'm just going to delete it for example's sake. Let's say you didn't have that point there. You don't really even need it. I can still take my notch tool and right click on my line and I get a very similar window. It's pretty much the same window, except it's got a different name, with the same information I had gotten from my add point split line tool. So I can again tell it I want that to be 8 inches long for this line and place a notch there. Bam, it's done. So I don't have to worry about manipulating any of these points if I don't want to. My sewing relationships have maintained, so that's good. So just know that you can add notches to existing points. You can right click on segments and tell the system exactly where you want to put your notches. You have options. I'm going to go ahead and click on these points just so I can add my notches there. I want to give myself an indication of where my hems are. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. I have had a very hard time with notches in corners. They very rarely work properly. You can change the direction of them so I can at least say, yes, this notch is going to tell me where my hem is, but it doesn't really indicate where my seam allowance is. If I rotate them to segment 2, that'll show me where my seam allowance is, but not indicate where my hem allowance is. It is tricky. I don't want to do, 45. That moves everything. So I'm hoping there's going to be updates for this, because I'd love to be able to just click into a point and have it add 2 perpendicular lines pointing to that point, so I know exactly where my hem allowance is. For now, I would do away with these. I'm just going to right click on this notch with my notch tool and choose delete, just so I don't get confused. Oftentimes when I finish a pattern in CLO, I will export it to Illustrator to then add these little notches in manually, so I know where they are. But for now, I'm just going to have to remind myself that my hem allowance is 1 inch, so I don't lose track of how much fabric to remove, and that my seam allowance is 1/2 inch, because there isn't really a quick and easy way of marking notches in corners. So I do want to add notches to my extension on my waistband. I want to keep my internal line because that'll give me a good indication on my pattern where my extension is, but I also want to add a notch to it. But I'll show you what happens when I click on this point. It's trying to add a point to the internal line itself, and it's making that little notch, it's heading off into this direction, off to the right, and it's not showing up on my pattern down here, so it doesn't really help me. Now I can go in and try to change the angle of it and whatnot, but it still doesn't show up on my seam allowance, my actual pattern edge. So I'm going to undo that, and I'll show you what I end up doing instead. I'm just going to click on the edge of my actual pattern piece, and you'll see that notch show up where it needs to be. And then using my notch tool, I'm just going to click and drag that notch into place. And I'll do the same down here. I believe this is the corresponding edge. That goes to that edge. Okay. I'm looking for the bottom edge of my facing. I'm going to put a notch there, and then again with the notch tool, just click and drag it into place. So that's a little bit finicky. And again, there isn't a really good way to add notches in the corners. So hopefully one day that will be an option. So I've got some notches. I know where my zipper is going to end. I know where my extension is. I know I want a 1/2 inch seam allowance and a 1 inch hem allowance. I can also add that as annotations in there, so I can remind myself of the seam allowance and hem allowance in case I don't finalize anything in Illustrator to make all the patterns done and dusted. I'll show you how we go about adding those annotations. That's this tool here. It looks like a little text box, and you can just click in any of the pieces and you can write, you know, back, skirt, lower layer, 1/2 inch seam allowance, 1 inch hem allowance. You can write pretty much whatever you'd like in there, and wherever you put this pattern piece, that annotation is going to follow. I'm going to go ahead and name all my pattern pieces because, again, I'll just call it back, left, skirt, lower, back, right, skirt, lower, front, skirt, lower. This will make it easier when I'm drafting out pieces. Back, left, skirt, upper, back, right, skirt, upper, and front, skirt, upper. Okay. If you don't like the annotations, you can choose the edit annotation tool. You can move it, you can delete it. But it's a good tool to have in that you can make these changes directly in CLO. Again, I prefer to finalize all my patterns in Illustrator, but get accustomed to doing as much of the work as you can in CLO. You can also hide the annotations if you get tired of looking at them. Turn that off, turn it back on. I can bring my point of measures back. Actually, oh, I deleted the piece that had the point of measure, so there's no longer any point of measure on there. But be sure to take points of measure so you can add that to your tech pack. So you got plenty of points of measure. You can change the name for those points of measure so you know exactly what that is, like upper skirt length, lower skirt length, whatever you need to. Take plenty of points of measure, zipper depth. Let the computer do the work for you with calculating all those numbers and bits and pieces, yeah? So I'm happy with how this is looking. Let's give this girl a little bit of movement and see what she looks like on the runway. Open up your library. It's docked over here on the left. Go into the avatar folder, double click on that. Double click the female V2 folder. We are using a female version 2 model, so we want to make sure we're staying in that folder. You'll notice there's a pose folder. You can double click on that and you'll see a lot of different poses that you can add if you want to give your girl a little bit of motion, just so she's got some kind of dynamics to her. I can double click on whichever pose I want, leave this window as it is. Click OK, and you'll see her move into that pose. As long as no pieces of your garment are frozen, they will move with her. So you can use this to take snapshots of your garment. You can get an idea of what this looks like. Taking a snapshot is as easy as going to File, Snapshot. You can take a snapshot of your 2D window, but I'm going to take a snapshot of the 3D window, and we'll put it somewhere in here. Save that. Oh, wait, no, don't do that. Circle skirt, PNG, give it a recognizable file name. You can choose the size of it. You can also go to multi-view, which I recommend. Multi-view will allow you to see the garment from multiple views. I'm going to do view count to 4. I'll make this the front view, the left view, the back view, and the right view. There we go. So you see her from all angles. You can choose the preset for the size. This is a good preset. Just keep it as full HD. I want to keep them as portrait images, so they are portrait images, and resolution 72 is fine for screen. Horizontal layout, you can change it to a vertical layout if you really want to, but I would keep it with horizontal. You can do a box if you want to 1, 2, 3, 4, but I'm going to keep mine with horizontal. I'm not worried about transparent backgrounds. I want to keep this as one image, but if you wanted to make 4 separate images, you could. We don't have any colorways built in just yet. We'll get to that a little bit later. I don't need to save an HTML file. I'm not putting this up on the web right now, but I can save that. And if I open up that image, there we go. We've got... I gotta change the view on here because you may or may not be able to see this, but you'll have all 4 views all saved as a single image, and you can see it from all angles. And of course you can change those angles, 3/4 and things like that. I'm gonna take her back to her default pose. That's this FV201 A pose. That's her A pose. I'm gonna double click on that, keep everything the same here. Click OK, and she'll go back into her A pose. Now, we know how to add motion to her. Let's go ahead. We know how to add a pose to her. Let's add some motion to her. Again, that avatar female V2 folder, the motion folder is what we want to go to. There are 5 motion files included in CLO by default. I like the no hands pose, especially when we're working with large skirts. Sometimes some of these other files, she'll put her hand on her waist or something like that, and her hand will face through the skirt or the waistband, and then she goes to pull her hand away and the waistband is stuck to her hand. It's a pain to try to go and fix. So I like to go with the no hands pose so she doesn't get her hand in the way of the garment. Keep these by default. 30 FPS is fine, and click OK. It doesn't look like much has changed, but she has moved from the center of this grid. She's still in her A pose. She's just sitting back here in this back left-hand corner. I'm going to close my library just so I have a little bit more real estate. And in order to run this animation, I'm going to go up here to the upper right-hand corner of the window of the software. It says simulation. I'm going to click on this little downward facing arrow and choose animation. This is going to change our workspace. We've lost our 2D patterns. So if you need to make any changes to the patterns, you need to go back into your simulation workspace. The animation workspace, it kind of assumes you've already done all you need to the patterns. You're happy with how things are looking. The colors and the zippers and the sewing and whatnot is done. Your window, your library is still available over here. You can still make changes to the fabric. So if you want to change some properties of it, you can still do that, but you can't make too many changes to the patterns themselves. Down here, you'll find the timeline. And if you hover between this window and the timeline, your little cursor should change to little arrows facing in 2 different directions. You can click and drag this timeline up just so you have a little bit more space. You can see there is now these red bars in here. These were not here before, just trust me on that. We've got a transition, which is her moving into the start of her walk cycle. So there's one part to this animation that has started that's been added to the avatar. And then we have the no hands pose where she walks down the runway. She does a little turn at the end of the catwalk, turns around and walks back. So that is the no hands pose. And we have a transition from her A pose into the start of that walk cycle. So you'll notice she's the only thing moving. I need to make the garment move with her. To do that, I'm going to click on this button right here. It looks like a camera with a little stop icon on it. And I'm going to click on here and I'm going to probably pause my recording because it's going to be a little bit resource heavy on my computer. But I'll come back once this recording is done. Okay, she's gone through her recording, and you can see as I scrub through that timeline, you'll see the garment is now moving with her. Her waistband's kind of skewing around her waist, which I'm not happy about, but we're just going to let it be what it is. It's better than her entire garment falling off of her, because that will happen as well. There are ways of preventing the waistband from doing that, but I'm not going to worry about that for right now. To play this back, we want to change frame stepping here to real time because otherwise she's going to walk really, really fast. And then we can just press this play button and you should see her walk. Of course, you can still tumble around, but you can see what this garment looks like with this cloth simulation as our girl is moving. Yeah, her waistband's slipping. Her zipper is now on her side, but whatever. We're going to go with that. Ways to make that to prevent that from happening would be to pin the waistband to the avatar. We already have it locked to that waistline measurement, but you can also add pins where your fabric is actually pinned to the avatar's body. That's good for keeping things in place, like a waistband that might be twisting, or if you're working on a very low cut garment, it kind of can act like double-sided sticky tape to prevent any slips from happening on the upper portion of the body. I'll show you where that tool is in just a second. But now we have this animation. And now we can go to File, Video Capture, Animation. Time step has been changed to frame stepping. Okay. And this little window pops up down here. You can determine where the camera is, what kind of view you can see. And you'll notice there's a little box that's now shown up around my window here. This is not going to be a final render. This is not going to look amazing. We're literally just capturing what's happening directly in this window. And you can use a variety of software to do that, screen capture software to do that. But it's built in to this software here. So I'm keeping the preset at, let's try the 720. That's going to change the window a little bit. Landscape orientation is fine. And I'll go ahead and run that recording. She's already got that motion added on there, so this should move a little bit faster. It's just doing a screen capture right now. Again, it's not going to be a super highly detailed render. If you've got any special fabrics or anything like that, you're not going to get as much detail out of this. But this is fine for just showing you how to do a screen capture with the software. Okay. And now that that's captured, I'm going to press stop. That's a little stop icon. And then I can scrub through this to see what this video looks like. There's a big timeline. I can play through it just so I can see what that screen capture looks like. Again, not a high detailed render. You would go into, you can render out videos from this software. I don't recommend it. I'll show you. I don't recommend it. I use other software when I'm rendering because this is a cloth simulation software. It's not a rendering software. It renders fairly well, but not perfectly. But this is good for quick renders, quick screen captures. You can send to a client, say, this is what it's looking like. This is how it's moving. Do we need to make any changes, kind of thing. So I'm going to save that and put it into here. Circle skirt video capture. And that'll export it as a MP4, which is pretty compatible with most systems. So now we've seen how to add zippers, how to modify those zippers, how to add poses, how to add motion, how to export snapshots, how to export videos. So there's a lot of methods for capturing what's going on in the CLO environment that you can then share with teammates, share with clients and the like, to quickly get feedback as to whether we need to make any changes or whatnot. Let me show you where those pins are. That's back in the simulation window. And if we make any changes to this, it'll probably erase the animation, which is why I say just kind of go with it right now. I'm going to right click on my avatar while she's in the simulation window and choose Move All Avatars and Garments to Center. You'll get this little warning saying the motion is going to be deleted if you do this. Like, yes, I understand. And if I go back into the center, you can see she's repositioned. And if I go back into the animation window, you see the garment animation is still on there. We can delete that. We don't need that. But her motion animation is now disappeared. She's not going to go anywhere. Let me show you where those pins are. I zoom in here because I want to pin it at her side seam. Over here, the tack tool. If you click and hold it, tack will pin the fabric to itself, which can be useful for some applications. Click and hold, you'll find tack on avatar. You can click once on the garment and then it goes clear so you can see where the avatar is, and click once on your avatar. It will pin the fabric to your avatar. It's similar to pinning it to a dress form. Now, obviously, you would not do this on an actual person. But again, it's kind of the equivalent of double-sided sticky tape. I'll pin it at the center front too, just so it don't go nowhere. But then I would go and add my motion back and run through the animation again, and it shouldn't shift around her waistband. But keep those processes in mind, making snapshots, adding motion, doing a video capture, so that you have those techniques under your belt.